From the Ash Rises a Phoenix. Chapter 13. Written by Kangarooney. Head pounding, Mikasa batted at the feeling. What? Why was she so tired? She tried to open her eyes, but found them crusted shut. She tried to rub the crust away, yet her limbs felt so heavy. Only when she moved her head did she realize what an odd angle she was resting at. Her world swayed. Her seat was mobile. She sagged to the right. Where? Whatever she sat on began to walk. The surface it walked on was a downward slant, and Mikasa's face smushed against a sweaty, furred body. It smelled like a horse. She was mounted. Wait, how did she get here? Mikasa remembered that Eren, he tried to... She felt her muscles jerk. Eren had hurt himself trying to get water for them. She needed to check on him. She needed to see him, but her muscles were twitching instead of working. Her body trembled. Her eyes remained glued shut. How had he gotten them on horses? Was it Armin who helped her up? She forced her lips open, yet no sound came out. She tried to see, but her eyelids refused to open. Her body trembled. Below, the horse walked steadily. Its gait was unbothered. Aside from the sideways tilt, she wondered if it even knew she rode it. Dehydration. Of course. Her thoughts were scattered. Her body felt cold and hot at the same time. Her eyes were crusted. She had no strength. And, of course, they'd had very little to drink over the course of the last few days. When the Jaegers adopted Mikasa, she refused to eat or drink. She refused to live. How could Mikasa live when all she saw was her mother's body on the ground? Mother was always filled with such life, always running around and teaching Mikasa to explore. Mother was filled with vitality. When she died, Mikasa couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't move. She'd let the men... They're monsters, Mikasa, Eren had told her. Men don't kill our families. Grab her head and drag her away. She'd let them push her in a corner and argue and plan. She'd sat in the corner and stared at Mother lying on the ground, dead. Even after Eren came and told her to fight, if you fight you'll live. Even after she stabbed that monster. Even after he dropped her scarf on her head and told her, you look cold. Even after she curled up beside Mother's body, held her hand and cried, Mother, don't leave me. Even after Mr. Jaeger arrived and hugged Eren like a father hugs their child, like her father would never hug her again. Even knowing he was dead at the door, unmercifully propped against a wall with a blanket thrown over him when Eren showed up, Mikasa refused to eat or drink. The growls from her stomach hadn't drowned out the growls of the men as they pushed Father's body in the corner. The twisting in her throat hadn't drowned out the twisting of her heart when Mother cried, Mikasa, right as she died. Mr. Jaeger told her she needed to eat to live. Mrs. Jaeger tried to ply her with sweet drinks so she might live. Eren hugged her. Still, Mikasa remembered dying. She remembered choosing to die, even after choosing to fight. Unlike Mikasa, they didn't give up. When she threw the food to the ground, Mr. Jaeger only picked it up. When she poured the expensive drinks on the table, Mrs. Jaeger sighed and ruffled her hair. When she remained limp in Eren's arms, he held her hand and pulled her outside. And somehow, somewhere, she began to eat, to drink, to relax in his arms, and to look up at the stars. And she lived, one day at a time. She lived. When Mikasa was young, she refused to try. How naive she had been, to think her life couldn't move forward, to think her challenges were so great she would never survive. No. Mikasa's body trembled. Eren was the reason she lived. Eren's family made her their own and never gave up. Mrs. Jaeger loved her. Mr. Jaeger taught her. Eren encouraged her. She would not bow down. Mikasa would fight. She spent years on the streets in terrible conditions. What was this experience to that? She may be tired, she may be weak and hungry, but she wasn't alone. As long as her family lived, so too would Mikasa. She pulled herself out of the reminiscing and pried her eyes open. She couldn't see. Her vision was blurry and too bright. Her head ached from the piercing light. The more she blinked her eyes, the clearer her vision grew, until finally she could see the legs of the horse below and the grass underfoot. Her neck ached when she tried to move her head to look further. Mikasa cursed in her mind and breathed deep. She was so weak. She needed to move. She needed to see where she was. Her muscles twinged in pain. Her arms were numb. She knew that as soon as she moved, the blood would begin to flow again and fill her body with needle-like pain. Careful, she wiggled her fingers and worked on loosening her arms. Her heart thudded and her muscles constricted, angry and cramping. Mikasa hissed out a breath, whimpering as the feeling returned. She had to keep moving to get the blood flowing, to speed up the recovery. Walls, she hated this feeling. Her breathing increased to rapid panting. Ugh, she moaned out as the needling moved down her back into her legs. Her toes felt like they were disconnected from her body. She knew they were there, yet they felt like they belonged to some other person. Eyes wound shut, she focused on breathing, deep and slow. Her entire body felt like a cord ready to snap. Everything cramped and tingled at once. The pain seemed to stretch on until suddenly those cold blocks at her feet were her own toes. The cramp in her thighs no longer ached. She could rotate her neck with only a few twinges of pain. Her hands relaxed. Mikasa opened her eyes and was able to lift her head, to look out and focus further than the ground. A lake stretched out before her. Its water was placid, tranquil, unlike the ponds she and her brother once played in. Sand lined the shores. Sand? Ever since 835, when the walls were destroyed, their civilization was pushed away from the land they once mined. Sand was one of those resources that turned rare with the loss of their land. Focus. The horse she was on was grazing on healthy and long grass. The grass of Rosa was well picked clean. Hungry horses, cows, goats, and sheep forced to graze on the bare minimum, like the people who survived the Great Purges. Long, luscious grasses swayed in a gentle breeze. Skinny horses hungrily devouring everything they could eat, and Armin? He was sagging to his side, tied tightly to his own mount. Where was her brother? She forced herself upright and tried to scan the surroundings again. Where was his horse? Why wasn't he also tied to a horse? He'd been injured. Was he alive? Her eyes itched with a need to cry. She choked on the air. Mikasa was at her limit. Her limbs began to tremble. Her vision wavered, going dark as her eyes fluttered. Fight. He always said to fight. How could she fight when she could barely stay awake? How could she fight when she was dying, tied to a horse with no water? Water. She forced her eyes open once more and fixated on the lake. An entire lake of water. Somehow they'd found exactly what they needed. She could save them. Armin was unconscious, but she could bring him back with a little water to his lips. And when she finds Eren, she'll do the same for him. She needed to live, one day at a time, one step at a time. She forced the knot in her throat down. Swallowing heavily, Mikasa lifted her trembling hands to her mouth and breathed. She could taste the salt on her lips. She could hear the wind in the grass and the horses munching. She could feel the body between her legs. She could smell the flowers in the meadow. And, opening her eyes, she could see Armin just a few arm lengths away. She focused on her senses, and slowly she could feel the tension dissipating. Mikasa felt the exhaustion fill her bones. She forced it down, just one step at a time. She looked at the rope lashed around her legs and the saddle. Whoever had tied her hadn't patted her legs, increasing the bruising she had experienced. While she could feel her toes again, they felt fat. Her blood had pooled in her legs and caused swelling. The knots, originally held tightly with rheum, were now straining with stress. The constriction was almost tight enough to act as a tourniquet, a surefire way to lose her legs. Praise the walls, the saddle girth strap had loosened, otherwise she may be facing a different problem. She leaned over her right leg and began picking at the rope, finding the tail end and working one-handed to loosen the knot. Despite her need for water, she was also blessed the horse hadn't decided to enter the lake. Otherwise, the rope could have swollen and made the knot impossible to untie. As it was, she was managing to work it free. With the release of the knot, Mikasa felt as her precarious balance shifted. One moment, she was leaned to the right, breathing at the exertion. The next, the saddle slipped completely, and she lay flat on her back, saddle still attached to her left leg, and horse running away. Oof, she exhaled in surprise. Her view was completely turned. Now, she stared at the sky and the clouds peacefully drifting overhead. Now, she heard the startled snorting and neighs of her mount. Now, she tasted blood from biting her lip. She rolled to her side and managed to untie her left leg. Well, that was one way to dismount. She felt her lips twitch with a smile. She didn't know how she planned to dismount, so that problem was solved for her. Mikasa rolled to her stomach and managed to push to her knees before swaying. She needed to crawl to the water to increase her strength. She needed to help herself first. No matter how much she wanted to get Armin and find Eren, she'd be useless without tending to herself. Slowly, Mikasa crawled to the lake. While the grass looked soft from horseback, she soon discovered it was anything but that. The leaves were razor-sharp against her palms. Sticks jabbed into her knees, and then rocks the closer she drew to the water. Mikasa almost cried when she felt the cool touch of water lapping at her wrists. She opened her eyes and looked down at the sandy water. She collapsed to the ground and opened her mouth, letting it saturate her tongue. She ate to swallow as much as she could. But Dr. Jaeger's words filled her mind, and Mikasa remembered his lessons. Eren never listened, but Mikasa soaked the knowledge up. She remembered how he would let water seep into the patient's mouth with a rag. A few drops at a time to get them used to the moisture. A few small sips to prepare their body for the nutrition. First water, then soup. Light foods. Easy foods. Lots of liquids. If the patient got into the water and drank quickly, they'd vomit it back up, weaker than before they'd had any. Carefully, she closed her mouth and let the liquid trickle down. Though cool to her skin, it felt like boiling water as she swallowed. Her throat burned. With Dr. Jaeger's lessons in mind, she stayed careful. When her stomach twisted and knotted, she closed her mouth and breathed. When it settled, she would sip a little longer, then breathe and repeat. She rolled to her back and out of the water and began to shiver. Even with the sun overhead, the water was seeping her body heat out. With how weak she was, Mikasa couldn't afford to lose any energy like this. She felt a little stronger, the nourishing water already doing wonders for her. If it were just her, Mikasa could curl into a ball and sleep, knowing it to be the best medicine. But with Armin still tied and Eren missing, she couldn't let herself stop moving. Mikasa carefully stretched her arms and twisted to relieve the locking of her back, groaning as everything cracked. Limbered and loose, she rolled to her knees and carefully pushed upright. She didn't sway. Her gaze returned to Armin. He was her next priority. With care, Mikasa rose to her feet, only to immediately drop back to her knees. Her legs couldn't hold her, despite her increased energy. Fine then, she'd crawl to him. Painstakingly making her way to the blonde, Mikasa was still quicker than her own trip to the lake. Her luck continued to hold when the horse remained unbothered by her untying the blonde, and only jumping the slightest when Armin fell to the ground. Hauling Armin's body back to the lake drained Mikasa's reserves. She collapsed into the shallows again with him, and had to shove him off when her face was forced underwater. Mikasa panted heavily and ignored her waning energy. Even if she could only give him a little, Armin needed water. She cupped her hands and wet his lips. Instinctively, she watched his mouth open and tongue dart out. Thank the walls. Mikasa had managed to prop Armin's head on a rock a short distance from the water. His body heat was good, without a fever. He hadn't woken yet, but she was still hopeful. Until then, she lowered her head beside his and closed her eyes. She could take a short nap. Then she'd look for Eren. When Mikasa opened her eyes, the sun had set and darkness coated the sky. She wondered what had woken her. "Mikasa?" Armin croaked her name. "Armin." She groped until she found his face and cupped his cheek. "Armin." Ugh. Armin groaned, but moved his hand to hold her as tight to his face. "Where?" "I don't know. Wait." She crawled to the shore and soaked the rag in water, offering it to Armin. "Water." "Thank the walls." He eagerly opened his mouth and let her squeeze it in. So good. He sighed in relief. Mikasa continued to supply him water until he'd had enough. She cupped a few mouthfuls into her own before settling beside him again. Overhead, the stars glittered. Their light was weak, just peeking above the horizon. Mikasa spied the moon. "Eren?" Armin asked after a few minutes. She had fallen asleep and hadn't looked for him. How could she be so stupid? "It's okay," Armin squeezed her hand. "We'll find him." He didn't say what she knew they both were thinking. They'd find Eren, alive or dead. They'd find him. Armin released her hand, only to snake his arm under hers and around her back. She cuddled close, sighing while resting her head beside his. "We should sleep, regain our energy, look tomorrow." Like Dr. Yeager said, sleep was the best medicine. Mikasa nodded and let her eyes flutter closed. When the sun rose, they'd look for him. Movement jogged her from her slumber. In the blink of an eye, the darkness was gone, and sunlight warmed her body. The sun had risen a few hands above the horizon. Armin had caused her to wake by moving his arm out from under her head. He was frowning and wiggling his fingers. "You put my arm to sleep," he complained, wincing at the return of blood flow. Mikasa pushed a seat and smiled at his annoyed face. She licked her lips and crawled to the water's edge once more. Feeling a bit like a horse, Mikasa drank greedily and slowed when she felt the heavy weight in her stomach. She could feel her energy return. They hadn't eaten in days, and the lack of nutrition was telling. Unlike the horses, they couldn't just start chewing on grass. Armin had spent his days learning about plants and foods. She needed him to identify what could be eaten. She also needed to gather the horses and take stock of what they had. And they needed to find Eren. Mikasa rocked back on her heels and decided to try standing again. Her muscles hurt, and she could feel bruises forming along her legs and hands from the ropes and crawling on the ground. If she could stand, then she could walk, and if she could walk, then her tasks would be easier to complete. Mind made up, she settled into a crouch and slowly stood. She kept her knees bent to prevent locking them and cutting off blood flow. Her legs shook, but she felt balanced. Careful, she took one step at a time. What took 3 minutes of crawling took barely a minute of walking to reach Armin's seated form. Tired from the movement, Mikasa dropped to a seat beside him. "Wow," Armin patted her head. "You're so much stronger than me." She brushed his hand aside. "Nonsense. I just hydrated first. You'll walk in no time." She rubbed her muscles and focused on stretching again. "Armin, can you identify anything edible? We need to eat." Armin looked at their surroundings, grasses swaying in the wind. "If we can boil water, we could probably dig up the roots and eat those. It'll be better and require a lot of grass with a low return on value. But it'll work as a start," he offered. "I can get a pot from the packs, and we can use grass to start a fire as well." She rubbed her stomach. Anything is better than nothing. Plans made, Mikasa left Armin to pluck and pile grass for their meal. She found the saddles she and Armin had been tied to and hauled them back to their makeshift camp. Then she began to look for any other horses. They'd had 4 the last she remembered. If Eren were still on his horse, then the 4th should stay with him. She cast her gaze around, looking for anything. There! Halfway down the shoreline, she saw a horse taking a drink, while another paced back and forth. The first seemed entirely at ease, while the second was clearly distressed. Its lead rope appeared to be snagged. She didn't see Eren on either one. Mikasa carefully walked along the shore to the 2 remaining horses. The one at the water had bags on it, their packs. She thanked Sina for this good fortune. The other horse looked too hard for her to calm down. If it bumped her with a leg, she knew she would fall. Regretfully, she took hold of the one in the water and began to lead it away. She'd come back for the other one once her strength returned. It could survive a little longer. Having the horse to support her weight, Mikasa was able to return to Armin much quicker. She worked the knots, untying the bags, which dropped to the ground. The horse heaved a sigh of relief, settling to wait for each pack to be removed. "I'm sure that feels good." She scratched between its shoulders and smiled when it whickered. "I've got the pot." She rinsed it, and then filled it halfway with water before setting it beside Armin, who was hard at work digging in the dirt. "Thanks. Can you clear an area for a fire? I don't want to light the whole field aflame." "We could put it by the water?" She looked to where the ground turned from dirt to sand and stone. "That's a good idea." Armin gestured at the pile he'd built. "Use the grass for building a fire. We'll eat the roots. Once you've got it all ready, we can rinse the dirt and start cooking." Mikasa nodded, and within half an hour, she'd got a nice fire pit formed and began preparing a fire. They just needed a light, and then they'd be able to begin. Together, the duo worked, stripping grasses and rinsing the roots until they had a pot full and another pile besides. Then, with a bit of flint against a piece of broken blade, the fire was lit and water began to steam. The sun was past its peak and beginning to descend by the time they could sip at the grass water gruel. It tasted awful. It tasted like survival, and neither friend complained, having been worse off before. With the meal finished, Armin began to gather more, and Mikasa rose to see if she could catch the fourth horse. Whatever it was caught on was mixed in with the grass. She edged over a small mound and gasped when the object came into sight. Eren! She jolted at seeing his body face first in the dirt, wounds covering his skin. "Oh, Waltz, Eren!" Forgetting her caution, Mikasa surged forward and began to tug the lead out from under his body. The horse yanked before she could fully unwind it, and she gasped when Eren's body was dragged a meter before the rope was fully free. "Eren, Eren, Eren." She combed at his hair, hands hovering over the rest of his body, too scared to know. What if she was too late? Slow, careful, she placed hands on his shoulder and leg and rolled him to his back. His head lolled loosely. His face was covered in dirt, with rocks and sticks staying prickled in his flesh, dirtying more wounds. Eren? She could feel her breath quivering. The rock in her throat lodged, and her breathing grew erratic. "Please." She placed her hand over his mouth and held everything still. "Please." A puff of air. He was alive. Eren was alive. Oh, thank the walls. She collapsed onto him, her words garbled in her throat, and she choked and coughed and hugged him tight. "Eren, Eren, Eren."